Hello and welcome to the podcast with myself, Matt Davey, and my friend and colleague, Connor Godfrey. Today's podcast is all about film, specifically the Western genre. In my opinion, the superhero film of its day. Me and Connor go back and forth and cover the likes of modern westerns, classics, John Wayne, as well as why westerns aren't as popular as they once were.
I don't think it's nice, you laughing. You see, my mule don't like people laughing. It's the crazy idea you're laughing at him. Now, if you apologize like I know you're going to, I might convince him that you really didn't mean it.
The Western genre was huge, back in the day. Not so much now. I mean, obviously, there's been a few kind of modern films like this. Magnificent Seven was remade. True Grit's been remade recently. Django Unchained. Even Cowboys versus Aliens. But not really. That genre's come back. Do you think that they were underrated first time around, or do you think that they kind of had the recognition they deserve and we've just all kind of moved on?
No, first time around, they were huge. Like I say, in my opinion, the superhero films of their day, there were just so many. I can't remember the exact percentage, but there is like a ridiculous stat about the percentage of Hollywood films that were Westerns. It was incredible, really. So for a big period of time, Westerns, I think, were the go-to. For a lot of people, very much an American film, although it's ironic, really. You could say that the most popular Westerns ever made are the spaghetti Westerns that are Italian-made, filmed in Europe. And then you look at something like, the Dollars trilogy being spaghetti Westerns, but A Fistful of Dollars being a remake of the Japanese film Yojimbo, and then you have The Magnificent Seven that was a remake of Seven Samurai. I think that they're underrated now in the sense that I feel generally people are less inclined to go back and watch older films, generally, is my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. So a lot of the classic Westerns probably won't get the recognition they deserve, perhaps, nowadays. And the Westerns that are being made today, Django Unchained, very good. Perhaps the best modern Western, Hostiles, Christian Bale, very good. Even the True Grit remake I was snuffy about for quite a long time. I watched it recently all the way through and thought it was very good. I don't think it surpasses the original, but perhaps as good as the original. Arguably still didn't need to be remade, but still a very good film. And then you get the Magnificent Seven remake, which I don't think is very good. I think they wide of the mark there. It's a good cast, but it just wasn't a well-made film. And then The Hateful Eight, which is probably 40, 50 minutes too long. But it's a shame. I think there are so many good films that are Westerns from years gone by that, don't get the recognition perhaps now in, 2020.
I definitely think that's a general film problem. I think there's a lot of films of past eras that just don't get the recognition they deserve. I don't think many people our age have probably seen The Godfather, which is, considered to be one of the best films. I think there's a lot of films that are at risk of becoming sort of lost in the void of films. And I definitely think that's a problem, maybe due to the fact that they're not on streaming services and things like that. I guess that's a...
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, I think depending on where you live and what sort of cinemas you have, maybe you get sort of classic films that are re-released occasionally. I know where we are, that happens every now and again, certainly, but when it comes to Westerns, it's rare. It's not a regular thing. And perhaps when the cinemas reopen after the lockdown and they need something to play, because it's not going to be new films straight away, is it? It's not going to be new releases because they're going to have their own release dates. You know, maybe it's a good opportunity for them to play these sort of films, and give people the opportunity to see them on the big screen. You know, I mean, the Western genre is my favorite genre, and I've seen many films, many of them countless times, but I've never seen them on the big screen. I'd love to see that. So, you know, who knows? That may happen.
What are we going to do with this one, Frank? Now that you've called me by name,
Do you think we've kind of sort of talked about it, and something that I kind of believe the way films are, it tends to be like trends and certain eras of film. So right now, I'd say since about 2009, 2010, it's been like the superhero era, when the biggest hitters have, you know, been these CGI heavy superhero films. Do you think that we'll ever see Westerns come back? Obviously, they'll be different, but do you ever think we'll see another kind of Western era? And do you think if that ever happens, it will be a good or bad thing? Do you think it's going to ruin it or help?
No, I hope so. I think it'd be a good thing. I hope so. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's a generally held belief that they're very expensive to make, and perhaps the audience isn't quite there for it. So, you know, studios are going to probably make westerns at a loss. Not all of the time. If you get like Tarantino to do it, who likes, you know, Django Unchained, I'm sure did very well, and The Hateful Eight. But back, you know, when westerns were a big deal in the 50s, 60s, you had star power. You went to the movies to see a specific actor. So you would go to a film to see John Wayne, to see Clint Eastwood, to see Henry Fonda, to see James Stewart, Glenn Ford, Randolph Scott, Gary Cooper, that helmed these movies. Nowadays, I mean, you have big stars, but off the top of my head, maybe two actors that have that appeal would be DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. You look at someone like Robert Downey Jr., as big as he is, you know, the face of the MCU, Iron Man, a career-defining role, one of the most well-known people in the world, and yet you look at his films away from the MCU. In 2014, you had The Judge, which is a perfectly good film, but didn't do well at the box office. And then you look at this year, Dolittle, that completely tanked. So I don't know, you know, I feel for westerns to have a resurgence, you'd need a big name to helm them, and I'm not sure you're going to get that. I mean, look at the Magnificent Seven remake, Denzel Washington, a big star. Chris Pratt, you know, fresh off Guardians of the Galaxy, still didn't do well.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually, that I think gone are the days when people would go to the cinema to watch a specific actor. I mean, Will Smith in the 90s springs to mind. I think definitely he had that star power, and he probably single-handedly took films like Men in Black, and I'm trying to think of other films, to like the next kind of level in terms of their box office return. But otherwise aren't really great films, but, you know, he's spawned a franchise out of. And that's nothing against him, he's a good actor, but he's lost that recently. I think films like Gemini Man have not done well. So I think gone are the days of that. I think, you know, there's so many reasons behind that.
Looking at the new waitress.
That's my steak, Valance.
And you heard him, dude. Pick it up.
First of all, I think actors just aren't as, I don't think actors are down to earth. I think that's something people can't really relate to them. I think, there's not really. I mean, you think of yesteryear and you think Steve McQueen was like the king of cool. You had like Paul Newman, these charismatic leads. I think Hollywood's definitely lacking that at the moment, perhaps because they're too scared to do something that's a bit out there, then they'll face a backlash. I think as well, reviews and things like that are making a difference. They're so easy to find, and social media, is giving everyone an opinion. It means that people will probably get put off. Actually, it's an interesting point. Those kind of films, especially Westerns, had these really important lead characters where I think the rest of the film isn't as important as it would be kind of now. I'm talking about John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Yul Brynner, these superstars that had the pull power. Do you think that, maybe not Clint Eastwood, because he's perhaps done more recently as a director and he's diversed his career, if that's the word. Yul Brynner's, and John Wayne obviously dead. Do you think that John Wayne as an actor was slightly overlooked and underrated? I mean, he won an Oscar, I think, for True Grit, which I'm going to be honest, I don't think is his best film, but, whatever. So do you think that him as an actor was overlooked and underrated? Or do you think the way he acted, he was very similar in most films? He's very rarely diverse. He often played the kind of anti-hero. Do you think that held him back to a certain extent? Or do you think he gets the right amount of recognition? What are your thoughts?
I think John Wayne is a bigger star than an actor, but still a perfectly good actor, still a very good actor. I mean, got his big break in a film called Stagecoach under the director John Ford. They collaborated many times together. And that was in 1939. And then in 1948, John Wayne made a film called Red River. And after seeing that, John Ford famously said, wow, I didn't realize he could act. They'd already made several films together. And so, John Wayne's, I suppose, a weird one in that sense. But then he was very good in other films that weren't Westerns, such as The Quiet Man, for example, perhaps. I mean, that was a film that won tons of awards, and he wasn't nominated for an Oscar, probably should have been. When you look at the Oscar he won for True Grit, is it his best performance? It's a good performance. It's a little different from the usual sort of John Wayne mold, but I think you also had Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton nominated that year as well, who famously neither of them actually won an Oscar. And at the time, they were both had the most nominations without a win. Eventually, O'Toole went and surpassed Burton. There's an argument to be had that one of them that year probably should have won over Wayne, but Wayne's Oscar was seen more as a lifetime achievement, I think, than the actual one performance of True Grit. Much of his roles were the same sort of character. I mean, he made a film in the 50s called Genghis Khan, where he played Genghis Khan, and he wasn't very good, and it flopped. And I think he soon realised after that, look, people just want to see John Wayne. And he wasn't John Wayne in real life, but I think he knew what people wanted, and he probably got the best out of himself for that.
Yeah, okay, there's some good points about John Wayne in there. Do you think perhaps that's the same? I mean, do you think perhaps that as an actor, because he always played the same role, do you think that's perhaps why maybe you kind of list the best actors, and I think your mind automatically goes to like De Niro, Eastwood, Pacino, actors like that. Do you think, maybe even Tom Hanks, do you think that because he very rarely did do a really out there role, I mean, obviously, he plays the villain in some films, but do you think the fact that he never really truly did anything completely different perhaps stops him from being viewed as one of the best? Or do you think literally because his films are so old and they're quite not as easy to come across, do you think he's just not as appreciated by people now?
Perhaps. I mean, maybe there's an argument to be had. I don't necessarily agree with it. Perhaps he was so good at what he did, so good at what he portrayed, so natural within the role and at ease with himself, that he was almost too good, that he's undervalued, perhaps. I don't know, as portraying this, shall we say, John Wayne sort of character. Maybe it's too good that we don't appreciate it. I don't know. But he's certainly no Daniel Day-Lewis, is he? He doesn't have a reputation for, doing, The Last of the Mohicans and then Lincoln, shall we say, or, then in the name of the father with an Irish accent. It doesn't really happen. John Wayne is John Wayne. But like I said, I think he got the best out of his career for doing that, I think.
I mean to kill you in 1 minute, Ned, or see you hanged in Fort Smith at Judge Parker's convenience. Which'll it be?
I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man.
Fill your hand, you son of a bitch!
Okay, so you've kind of spoken about Wayne. I want to go back to kind of the genre. I think looking back on the genre in general, not that I've seen all the films, but they all tend to follow a kind of specific formula. And that formula is probably, come from previous films and it's definitely in today's films, that kind of anti-hero and becomes the hero, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that maybe is the formula behind why films are so successful, or do you think it's just pure coincidence? I mean, looking at like films that are really popular now, we kind of talked about Robert Downey Jr. earlier, but do you think maybe his kind of role as the anti-hero is made him so popular? Do you think that's just the standard formula now for films?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I think you look at the man with no name concept, that has quite a lot to do with that. Obviously, that being Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy. That then went into Leone's next film, Once Upon a Time in the West, with Charles Bronson. That idea of the man with no name has been, I suppose, copied in lesser westerns, both on the big and small screen. You also have several westerns, several references to the man with no name in Back to the Future, especially Part 3 of the trilogy. You also have the character of Boba Fett in Star Wars, which I didn't know this until I was doing some research, but Boba Fett is based on the man with no name. According to the actor that played him, his green and white armor resembled Clint Eastwood's poncho. You also have Uma Thurman in Kill Bill. The man with no name. It's a concept that has been, I suppose, used time and time again.
Did you bring a horse for me?
Well, looks like we're shy of one horse.
You brought too many.
Okay, so the genre of Western, I think, had its glory day and maybe is seen as just like a goofy kind of hero. I will say one thing that I think is underappreciated about Westerns is its effect on popular culture. I think the best Westerns are still being referenced and copied and ideas are being taken. I also think the kind of, I'm trying to think of the word, the achievement of them being made in general, I think is impressive to look back on. And I think the things that they were doing have changed cinema. I think, what comes to mind, The Good, Bad and the Ugly, the way that it's shot and the cinematography is unbelievable and I think holds up ridiculously well. And I think that definitely has had such an enormous kind of effect on popular culture that perhaps maybe Westerns are underappreciated for their time and maybe they're good technical achievements. Definitely. I think, I just think they were good for the time. I will say one criticism of Westerns would probably be how similar a lot of them are. I think, look, we kind of spoke about the formula, but I think a lot of Westerns are guilty of, I think my issue with Westerns is there's so many of them, they just saturated the market. And I think there's very few Westerns that are individual and want to do their own unique thing. I think they all tend to follow the similar thing. And I think that's perhaps why they died out. I think maybe it was just so many being made and it just saturated the market and people just didn't want them anymore. That I just don't think there's many fresh ideas. Obviously they do different shots and things like that, but I think the concept of a Western is pretty much the same in every film, which I think is definitely something that holds it back.
Yeah, no, I think you make a fair point. I think you look at something like Django Unchained that came out 8 years ago, I think now. a very individual, unique Western where you look at the two lead characters in a Western. You have Jamie Foxx, a black lead actor in a Western, which you really didn't have a lot of, if at all, back in the heyday of Westerns. And you have Christoph Waltz, who plays a German dentist. It's quite he's a bit more than a dentist, but so yeah. But it's a completely unique idea, and I think that's why something like Django Unchained is done so well. But even then, he uses the music of Ennio Morricone. Okay, it's new music, but again, Morricone composed music for the Dulles trilogy and Once Upon a Time in the West and so on. So yeah, I think you make a good point in that certainly some aspects of the genre do get a bit repetitive.
Like the pine trees lining the winding road, I've got a name. I've got a name.
Okay, so just going back to the actual formula and all that of the genre, what do you think that the genre needs to do now if it's to become, I mean, we don't know what's going to be the next kind of genre to kick on. Right now it's superhero films and they're being massively successful, and it's kind of been Star Wars and things like that, basically like kind of science fiction and things like that now. I guess the question is, what do you think is going to be the next big thing to come along and shake things up? And what do you think Westerns as a genre need to do to let that be them?
It's what, if I was, like I said, if I owned a cinema, I would, if I could, I mean, I don't know how easy it is, but I would re-release, you can't re-release films necessarily, but show the classic films, being Westerns as well, get people interested, see something on the big screen that you have never seen that way before. In terms of going forward in new Westerns, you had a film last year called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and in that you have DiCaprio, who plays an actor, Rick Dalton, and his character was on he was a cowboy in a Western TV series, and Tarantino has said he has written, I believe I'm right in saying this, something along these lines, but he has written the episodes for the TV show that Rick Dalton was on. I mean, can you imagine if that got released on TV? Or I think it's, not something Tarantino would direct, but certainly something he's written and that could happen, and that could spark an interest in people. I'm not sure you're going to get DiCaprio come to TV and play Rick Dalton in 8 episodes of Bounty Law, but, it's something like that could well grab the interest of the audience.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think perhaps the most successful ones have been the ones with the big name directors, like Tarantino.
I think you need a big name attached for it to do well. Certainly nowadays, I think.
Yeah, especially I think the director is more important now than the actual stars in the film. I think people would go and see a Tarantino film because his films because they're so unique and they're quite big gaps in between. Whereas I don't think everyone would go and see a DiCaprio film. So I definitely think the role of a director is a lot more important as a pull than it perhaps used to be.
You got a letter from Abraham Lincoln?
Yes.
The Abraham Lincoln?
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to talk briefly, if I may, about my favourite Western, being The Magnificent Seven. Released in 1960, it was a remake of the Japanese film Seven Samurai. Yul Brynner famously bought the rights so he could make it, very much his passion project. John Sturges directed. He'd made, before that, Bad Day at Black Rock, and is it Gunfight at the OK Corral? Or Last Train to Gun Hill, perhaps, he made. But he had made some memorable Westerns before that, and he made The Magnificent Seven, Great Escape after that. Perhaps one of the best casts of all time, sort of it's an all boys club, I suppose, but you have Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, that was cherry-picked by Brynner. Ironic, because they famously didn't get along during the filming. Charles Bronson, James Coburn, Brad Dexter, Robert Vaughn, Horst Buchholz. For me, the best Western. I think widely regarded as one of the best Westerns. Brenner at the time, he'd made The King and I, The Ten Commandments, huge star. 6 years later, Yul Brynner is no longer this huge star that he once was. He's no longer this go-to leading man. However, you look at Steve McQueen's trajectory. He's just made, he's making at the time The Sand Pebbles, where he gets his one and only Oscar nomination from that film. Should have had more, but we won't go into that today because of various reasons he was overlooked. So Yul Brynner comes back. He needs the success, so he goes ahead with a sequel. And Return of the Seven, 1966, 6 years after Magnificent Seven. Steve McQueen shows interest in returning to his character. Yul Brynner vetoes it. Instead hires Robert Fuller to play Vin. And famously, Chico, who is played by Horst Buchholz in Magnificent Seven, is also replaced. The film does not do well. You look at IMDb, The Magnificent Seven got a 7.7. The Return of the Seven just 5.5. And then 6 years after Return of the Seven, you get The Magnificent Seven Ride, with Lee Van Cleef. Again, does not do well. Only 5.7 on IMDb. Just your general thoughts on this, Godfrey, in the sense that The Magnificent Seven is such a big success. Not initially in America at first, but sort of travels around the world, and Asia does really well, and Europe eventually feeds back to America and then does really well. And an eventual sequel baiting later on where it completely just bombs. Do you think they were right to look into this and right to not cast Steve McQueen? I mean, surely not.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Steve McQueen, I think, especially if he was a lot more famous then, I think would have had that pull power to perhaps make some more money. That being said, I mean, it's a difficult one. If Yul Brynner owns the rights to the film, what can they do? I think it's a tricky one for sure. I just think maybe, I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure it's not a terrible film. I'd imagine it's more...
It's not great.
6 years is a long time though. And I think perhaps maybe when they made the original, well, it's a remake of A Seven Samurai, but the original one of it, I think Westerns were probably just a lot more popular. And I think perhaps the reason why actors like Yul Brynner and kind of saw that stardom kind of start to deplete was perhaps their choice of movies. I think perhaps why Westerns aren't as fondly looked on as maybe as they should be is they just didn't quite know when to stop making them. Maybe, the first one was made, it was great, and they started to come towards the end of this massive genre. And I think maybe 6 years later, Westerns weren't as relevant. They didn't have the pulling power. That's perhaps why actors like Yul Brynner aren't as fondly looked on, because their choices of projects later on in their career weren't the right ones to help them maintain that level of stardom.
Yeah, I think you're right, to be fair. And a final point I'd make on this is that you look at The Magnificent Seven, as well, you have Eli Wallach, who plays the Bandit Calvera, a very good casting choice, I think. Something iconic about that movie is the music by Elmer Bernstein. And again, it's something that gets referenced and parodied occasionally in popular culture. So even if you're not aware that music is from The Magnificent Seven, you've probably heard it. And it feels... It's so well used in The Magnificent Seven. Just the music and the pictures are one. And they literally rehash that music in The Return of the Seven, and especially in The Magnificent Seven Ride. And it feels, completely out of place. Like The Magnificent Seven Ride, I think if it had nothing to do with being meant, if it wasn't called The Magnificent Seven Ride, and if it didn't have Magnificent Seven music, it'd be a perfectly okay Western. But the fact it follows on from The Magnificent Seven and it's sort of intertwined, it's just, it's a letdown, really. It really is.
It's funny. Now that he's gone, I kind of miss him.
But something I'd like to move on to is the list of 1001 movies to see before you die, and the westerns that make it onto there. So you have the 90s westerns of Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven, but from what I would call the heyday of westerns, from the late 30s to the mid 70s, you have Stagecoach, of course, John Wayne's breakout role. Red River, John Wayne's, one of his better performances where he doesn't just sort of play himself. Winchester 73, and then you have a run of 3 films: High Noon, Shane, and The Searchers, all of which are regarded, depending on who you speak to, they will be the best Western ever made. You then have Gunfight at the OK Corral, Man of the West, Rio Bravo, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, HUD, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Once Upon a Time in the West, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Wild Bunch, Little Big Man, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, High Plains Drifter, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and The Outlaw Josie Wales. And if you look to the IMDb top 250 films of all time, their list of the top 250 films of all time, right on 250, you get Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. 147, you get Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood's last ever Western. 110 for a few dollars more, the middle of the Dollar Trilogy. At 60, you get Django Unchained. 48, Once Upon a Time in the West. And the highest ranked is 13, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Do you have any thoughts on this, Godfrey? I mean, just a handful there in the IMDb top 250.
Interesting one. Again, I haven't seen all the films, so I don't want to offend anyone. I will say The Good, Bad, and the Ugly and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are 2 of my favourite films of all time, not just Westerns. I think Good, Bad, and the Ugly especially is a phenomenal piece of, I don't know, engineering is the right word, but the music, the cinematography, the way it's shot, the colours, the characters, the acting is all spot on. It's such a good film, not just a good Western, it's just a really, really good film. And I think it's had such an effect on popular culture that not many other films have. I think Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is also one of my favourite films. I think it's so much fun. I think the comedy as well, I think it just holds up so well. And I think that's a really big problem with older films. The comedy doesn't hold up, and that's not the film's fault. That's just because comedy has changed, over the course since they were made. But the comedy in that film holds up really well. And I think with that film, that's kind of makes it different from the Dollars trilogy, especially, although Man with No Name, blah, blah, blah. I think the natural chemistry between Robert Redford and Paul Newman is among the best natural chemistry I've ever seen in a film.
Perhaps
I think
the best
they
power
look
couple.
like best friends. Yeah, they just look like they're having so much fun in the role, which I think makes... I mean, I'm not into Westerns, and I remember watching that film and having so much fun. I didn't care what was going on. It was just so much fun watching those two. Because they just look like best friends, and they've just been made of, just gone, let's make a film. And it was just so much fun, and everything about that film was so natural. It felt like why wouldn't they jump into a massive ravine? Do you know what I mean? It just seems so natural watching it. So those films I definitely rate very highly, and I'm surprised Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid isn't higher, because I think that film has a lot of moments in it that are so influential and so genuinely just really good.
Well, to be fair, I was surprised to see, I like For a Few Dollars More, and it is very good. I was surprised to see that so high up, 110, but like you say, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid right on the bottom, 250. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was 8.0 out of 10 in the top 250. Something like Dances with Wolves was had the same rating, which just misses out. Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, just to touch on what you've said, famously Newman and Redford had never met each other before filming, and then famously were very good friends. Ironically, their second film, The Sting, also made it onto the IMDb top 250.
Very, very
Well, that ought to do it.
Think you use enough dynamite there, Butch?
just quickly to touch on these films, if anything, I think it shows that people's favourite westerns are the spaghetti westerns, because you have, for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 2 of the $3 trilogy. You have Once Upon a Time in the West, that was the only film after the Dollars trilogy. You have Django Unchained, which isn't a spaghetti western, it's Tarantino western, but it's inspired from the film Django, a spaghetti western, and includes music from Two Mules for Sister Sarah, which was another Clint Eastwood film that isn't a spaghetti western, but again, sort of from that same sort of breadth. You have Unforgiven on the list, not a spaghetti western, but stars Clint Eastwood, famous for starring in spaghetti westerns. And the only one that's sort of the outlier, really, is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but it's completely unique in its own way.
Yeah. More of a comedy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, really. So what I'd like to move on to now, just before I ask you a couple of questions to finish up, is some iconic movie moments throughout cinematic history that are specifically Western. So I'll just run through them, and if you have anything to say at the end, feel free.
Yeah.
So I have the doorway scene from The Searchers, the sort of closing shot of The Searchers. When John Wayne returns, you have his friends and family walk into the building, famously just him alone between the doorway, after a few seconds turning away, doing his famous sort of John Wayne top-heavy big man walk into the wilderness, that symbolises a man trapped in the wilderness. I've got the Duel, I've called it the Duel, from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, when they have to stand off in the graveyard, the iconic music, iconic close-up shots. For me, one of the best sort of 10-odd minutes in cinema history. Lee Van Cleef famously said he was just lucky that he was born with piercing eyes, but it works very well. I've the harmonica scene in Once Upon a Time in the West, where you see the first shot of Charlie Bronson, the man with no name, where there's 3 bandits, I suppose, on the other side of the track, and he says, have you got a horse for me? And they said, no, we're one shy, and he just shakes his head and he says, no, you've brought 2 too many. And then you get the standoff, and of course the gunfight that results after that. 2 from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Bicycle montage, shouldn't be there, shouldn't work, but it is there, and it does work. When Paul Newman crashes the bicycle, and he turns and he sees, is it the cow? I think it's a cow, isn't it? And he just pouts and he runs away quickly before it gets him. And the freeze frame ending, the ending of the film, where, I bet it's just one guy. Australia, we should go to Australia, Bolivia. Australia, they speak English. Bet it's just one guy. Run out, freezes on them. The screen goes from colour to sort of discolour, and you just hear the shots being fired and the shouting of the soldiers, and the credits just roll. And the violence from the Wild Bunch, for me, both at the beginning and at the end of the film. For me, it's one of those films where when somebody gets shot, and a lot of people do get shot, you really feel it. When someone gets shot, it's the slow-mo, it's the facial expressions, it's just the gore, it's the squibs and the blood flying out you hadn't really seen in Westerns before. That after that, you got in virtually any well-known Western after that, you get that sort of, even if it's not a violent film, when someone gets shot, like John Wayne in The Shootist or any Clint Eastwood film after that, you get that sort of, that gore, that blood, which made director Sam Peckinpah, he famously had an outburst on set because he wasn't happy with how things were looking, and he went, no, it's got to feel more realistic. And he just got a revolver and he just shot it into the wall over people's heads. He went, that's how I want it to feel, and that's indeed how it does feel. Any of those moments that stand out for you, Godfrey? Perhaps Butch Cassidy, perhaps Good, the Bad, and the Ugly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I like those films, so I guess naturally they'll stick out in my head more. I mean, I guess whether they're iconic or not is a point of view, which I guess is up to opinion. Although I would like to add, when John Wayne dies in The Shootist, I think you can tell when that happens, it's slightly more real than other moments in other films. I think you can tell in the film, maybe when, you look back on it on hindsight and it was his final role, I think maybe definitely, I think that should be included. I think that's such a gritty and realistic moment, because I think when you're watching that, you realise that, you know, you're watching the death of this character, but actually it's kind of a metaphor for John Wayne's life in general, I think.
You make a really good point there, actually. It's a very touching film. It's only 90 minutes long, all things considered quite a short film. It takes place really in one town. And I think you're right, because obviously John Wayne's character, J.B. Brooks, is suffering from cancer. He knows he's going to die. John Wayne had cancer about a decade before this film, survived it, and it was only a couple of years after this film was made he got it again, and he was far worse, and of course died of the disease. And who knows? Maybe if he could have had the option that his character had in The Shootist, die of this disease or die a hero or an anti-hero's death, I suppose, in a blaze of glory. Who knows? Maybe he would have taken it. I don't know.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, yeah, it's definitely a powerful moment that I think should be considered maybe more of a kind of a classic scene for sure.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
This is my birthday. Give me the best in the house.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, just going back to kind of your shouts for iconic moments, the good, bad, and the ugly, the close-ups at any point in the film are just phenomenal. I think that, definitely that they should be higher ranked. I think the music as well is fantastic in that film. It holds up so well.
Some of the best music put to screen, I think.
Yeah, I'm fully inclined to agree. Underrated, I think, that film in terms of its achievements of how it was made, rather than, I mean, don't get me wrong, the acting is good, of course it is, but I think underrated in terms of its effect on popular culture and how it was done, I think.
Okay, well, I've got a couple of questions just to finish off for you then. So if you had to, what would be your favourite Western? And indeed, where would that then be in your favourite films of all time?
I think it's torn between Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. I think The Good, Bad, and the Ugly is definitely a lot more gritty, and I think you have to kind of be in a certain mood to watch it. Whereas I think Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is a lot more relaxed and funny, and I think even the ending is kind of, even though they're going to die, I think it's very light in how it, kind of takes that message on. And I think the scene when they blow up the train is really funny. I think there's a lot of funny moments in it. They'd definitely be in the top 20. I'm going to be honest, I don't think they'd break in the top 10. I think I have seen better films, but definitely they're not just good Westerns though. I think that's the problem. I think because the genre's died out, people are like, oh, it's a good Western, when actually there's some really, really good Westerns that aren't just good Westerns, they're just really good films. And I think perhaps kind of, you talk about The Godfather that people don't appreciate. I think that's definitely a problem. The older films should be appreciated more. And I think some Westerns are part of that. I think a lot of them are really too samey and they don't offer enough to justify it. But I think there are certain Westerns like The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, like all the Dollars trilogy, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the Magnificent Seven. I think when you look at the cast, I think they should be a hell of a lot more appreciated than they are. And I think we're at risk of losing these great films to some sort of film void if we don't appreciate them while we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to add anyone who was anyone of the heyday of the Western genre was in a Western. I mean, Kirk Douglas, you name them. Quickly, something I'd like to very briefly mention is that if you like The Wild Bunch and if you like the shootouts from The Wild Bunch, check out The Long Riders, a bang average film until a 10-minute period in the last quarter of the film where it can only a gunfight can only be inspired from The Wild Bunch, and it is that 10 minutes make the film. But moving back onto my questions for you, my final question. Going forward with Westerns, is there anyone you would want to see in a Western that you haven't seen? That would make it for you, that would excite you?
Interesting one, I think. That's a good question, actually. I don't know. I guess I don't know off the top of my head, because I think a lot of actors have kind of dabbled with them a bit. You know, you Denzel Washington, Chris Pratt. It would depend what kind of Western. I think some comedic Westerns are okay, but I think if you're looking at a serious one, I really don't know. I really honestly cannot say. Perhaps someone... That's a really good question. You stumped me with that.
You know what? I'll change my question unless you have an answer and you want to go for it.
I was going to say perhaps like a Tom Hanks, but not so much actually the shooting side of it, because I think we've all seen the shooting side of a Western. I think perhaps more the psychological parts of a Western, I think, would be cool to explore, and maybe, you know, maybe a more in-depth about the time. I'd probably be more interested in a film about the time of a Western that's kind of historically quite accurate rather than another shooting film.
Okay, and I'm gonna ask you another question before we finish.
Yep.
The Magnificent Seven, my favorite Western, was remade. I didn't want it to be remade, but it was. I didn't like it. It's not a very good film. Well, that's being harsh. It's an okay film, but it's not patched on the original. Your two favourite Westerns, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, would also make my top 5. Very good choices. Do you think they could be remade? Would you want to see them be remade?
I mean, it's easy. It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think I wouldn't want to see any film that I love remade, but that's kind of a selfish way to look at it, because I think...
I mean, you can't imagine Paul Newman and Robert Redford, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You can't really replace them with, I don't know, I mean, a good double up we've seen from last year would be Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt. I'm not saying it should be them, but you can't see anyone else but Paul Newman and Robert Redford, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I do completely agree with that. And I think, you know, I probably wouldn't be over the moon if they did. But at the same time, sometimes I think with the lack of Westerns being watched now, I think, you know, they're not on Netflix or Prime or whatever. I think perhaps, you know, remaking these films, even if they're not as good, I think could be the only way to actually make them relevant enough again for people to appreciate them. Because I think The Magnificent Seven wasn't a huge hit. Maybe Django Unchained is probably a better example. I think more people will get into Westerns if there's a modern Western they can jump in with. I think that's definitely a problem. I was trying to think of a remake that's happened recently. I mean, I think like Batman, like the early, I know you're a fan of like the 80s and 90s ones. I personally really like the Dark Knight trilogy. When I was growing up, I really enjoyed the fun nature of not Batman and Robin, because I don't care how old you are, it's terrible. But the one before that, or even the Michael Keaton one, were really, yeah, okay. Well, they're a bit more fun, and especially Nicholson's Joker was very
incredible.
Jokey and, you know, okay, whatever. But and even when they announced they're making the Dark Knight trilogy, I was like, well, you know, what's wrong with the ones they're not that old? And then, you know, they come along and they make this gritty, dark film that actually has had a huge effect on how films are. Every film is from now on. And I think that was maybe not necessary to boot it. And maybe it was an improvement on the originals, but it helps a new generation and new fans get into the franchise. And actually that helps them appreciate the older ones. Kind of the same with Marvel, like rebooting films and things. Maybe it's not completely the right thing to do, but does it help a new generation get involved? Yes. I mean, even like the Jungle Book and things like Lion King. I love the classics growing up, and I'm not the biggest fan of the new ones, and at the end of the day, Disney do it for money. But, you know, does these new films coming along help people to appreciate the older ones? It helps me appreciate the older ones. I look back on it and think, wow, you know, it's so good for the time and the music was great. And I think things like that are just helping the newer generations connect with the older films. Actually, I think newer generations feel a lot more distant to the older films than ever before.
Okay, very good. I think we've touched on everything there, really. If anybody's interested, we have a website, godfreyanddavy.co.uk. You can find articles about Westerns on there. We have a top 10 of all time. So if you want to have a read, you can check out articles there. Yes, we'll leave it in the description. But Godfrey, thank you. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back in the near future.